We'll get started. So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for attending our talk, Making Equity Actionable with Tamika Butler. We're glad to have a lot of new and familiar faces here. My name is Keenan, and I'm the president of the UC Irvine chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers. So before we begin the talk, I want to address the snippet of Canon 8 below the flyer. It's a text that a lot of people in our field cite, which is from ASCE's Code of Ethics, which mandates that engineers shall treat all persons fairly and encourage equitable participation without regard to gender identity, race, economic status, etc. And while my chapter does want to encourage fairness and equity, we think it's incredibly important that moving forward that we strive to acknowledge gender identity, race, economic status, etc. And as we've been forced to confront these past few months, it's undeniable and unacceptable that race has been used to divide, not just explicitly, but by leaders who exclude policy that alienates and decision-making that oppresses. So it's important that as professionals who take so much pride in the fact that we create infrastructure, that we acknowledge how these actions have manifested through the built environment. So it's my strong belief that truly reckoning with the prevalence of American racism requires us to shatter these lenses that force us to be colorblind and acknowledge the gifts that make us so beautifully unique. So it's with great honor that I get to introduce one of my heroes, our guest speaker, Tamika Butler. Tamika is a nationally recognized expert and activist on issues at the intersection of anti-racism, public health, and mobility. She's the principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting and has dedicated her professional career to helping design professionals incorporate equity into their practice. She's here to help us engineers understand the concept of transportation justice, the meaning of true equity, and why we need to challenge conventional best practices. Everybody, please give a warm welcome to the incredible Tamika Butler.
Take myself off mute. Had to do it once. Thank you so much, Keenan, for the intro. As I share my slides and get started, I would love for folks in the chat to just share what brought you to our conversation this afternoon. When you do these things virtually, it's hard to not be able to see everybody, especially when you're sharing your screens and looking between different things, but also just not being there in person. And so I invite you throughout me speaking, put things in the chat, questions, whatever it may be, know that it definitely keeps me going and energizes me. And I know it's a Friday afternoon, and so I think we could all use a little energy and engagement. So again, as I'm sharing my screens and getting going, just share in the chat like what brought you here today. I'm really patient, don't worry. Thank you, Jennifer. Being brave, being the first one to jump in there. Would love to see other folks. Thanks, Brian. All right, working on sharing. Okay, so I am going to get started. Keep things coming in the chat. I still have it. I still have it up. Okay. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. Right, Keenan?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So when I get close to needing to stop, just put in the chat like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, because sometimes I get going. It's hard to stop me. But what Keenan asked me to talk about is just how do you make equity actionable? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am. There was also a request just that for especially folks who are coming to this conversation as students, having a little bit of an understanding of what I do and how I got to what I do. And then we'll end with kind of the meat of it, what can you do to confront power and privilege? So let's just get started with who I am. I am, I'm Tamika, and I'm someone who loves riding my bike. And when it really comes down to it, that's how I got into this work. I was participating in the AIDS Life Cycle, a ride from San Francisco down to LA. And I had a friend who I was training with who said, the Bike Coalition is hiring. And that opened up a whole new world to me of urban planning and design and engineering that I didn't really know about before. And so I think, whenever folks ask us who we are, I think we're trained in society to say, this is my name and this is what I do, and think about it in a very professional sense. But at my core, I'm just Tamika, and I'm just a person who likes to ride my bike. I work, as Keenan said, at Tamika Butler Consulting. It's a company I started on my own in July, so it's still fairly fresh. Immediately before that, I was working at a private transportation planning firm called Tool Design, which has landscape architects, engineers, and planners. And the founder of Tool Design, Jennifer Toole, trained as a landscape architect. Her philosophy was that every project should have an engineer and landscape architect and a planner to really think about it in intersectional ways. Our focus was on a lot of active transportation work, but we did all sorts of work. But as someone who loves to bike, that's why I was drawn there. My job at Tool was to be our California planning director, so overseeing our 2 offices in California. And then I was also the company's director of equity and inclusion. And so Tool Design had offices all over the United States and then 2 offices in Canada. And my job was both to think about how equity showed up in our work and our design and the way we talked about what a street should look like. But also my background is as an employment lawyer. And so my job was to make sure that our policies and procedures and everything we were doing was deeply rooted in equity. And so, when I say things like I'm Tamika and I like to ride bikes, a lot of people say, but you're a planner, right? Again, we're trained to think of ourselves in these professional ways. And so, am I a planner? How did I become a planner? I'm from Nebraska. And so I went to undergrad at Creighton University, which is a small Jesuit school. Why did I go to Creighton? It wasn't because there are a lot of Black gay Catholics in Omaha, Nebraska, who went to the school. But what I will say about my Jesuit education is it really deeply steeped me in social justice and about what it really means to be someone of service. And I think it really framed how I think about the work I do. After I was graduating from Stanford, I knew I wanted to go to law school. And I really just felt like, man, I'm so gay and I'm so Black and I cannot be in the Midwest. I have to get as far away as I can from the Midwest. So I applied to like 30 law schools and they were all out of the Midwest. And I thought I'm going to go to NYU or Columbia or some big city. And eventually I decided to go to Stanford. The thing is, when you're from a place like Nebraska and admitted student weekends are in the part of the year where you have snow, a place like Stanford is just much more attractive than a place on the East Coast because the weather is good. And also because, as I said, part of the reason I wanted to leave the Midwest is because I didn't necessarily see myself reflected as a gay Black person. Now, as somebody from Omaha, I had no idea that Palo Alto and San Francisco were very different places. I thought I was going to Stanford and I was going to some gay mecca, but Palo Alto is very different. And honestly, there are more Black people in Nebraska than I ever saw in Palo Alto, or frankly, even San Francisco. And that was a big part of the work I did after law school. I received a fellowship and I started workers' rights clinics in the historically low-income Black neighborhoods in San Francisco, the Western Addition, and then the other neighborhood was Bayview Hunters Point. And that was really my first interaction with transportation. My job was to start a workers' rights clinic in San Francisco. But what was happening in Bayview Hunters Point, and Bayview Hunters Point is where the San Francisco 49ers used to play at Candlestick Park. And the city decided to start a new Muni line that went to that community. And when I would sit down with people and say, tell me what's going on with your job, were you discriminated against? People would often say, before they would talk to me, before they could trust me, right? First, I had this hurdle that I don't look like what they imagined a lawyer looked like. I was this young 20-something law school graduate because I went straight from undergrad to law school. I was Black. They weren't used to seeing Black lawyers. I'm very queer. And so I was wearing like a bow tie, and they're like, first of all, I don't know who you are, but if I am going to trust you, I have to know where you stand on this muni issue. And many of the Black folks in Bayview Hunters Point felt like the rail line wasn't for them. Like the city had planned this rail line as a way to get white folks who weren't from the community to the football games and out of the football games. They didn't feel like anyone really talked to them about the stops, where they would be most helpful, the time the trains would run, how often the trains would run. And so that feeling of not having something planned for you or with you, but having it planned to bring other people in and still keep you separate, is something that really stuck with folks. And so before I could help them, they wanted to know how I felt. And that's when it really became clear to me that transportation is this prism through which we should see all of our social justice issues, because they couldn't talk to me about a job if they didn't feel like they had access to jobs in the core of the city center. They would not talk to me about healthcare if they didn't feel like they had access to healthcare, access to education. And so that's when transportation really became huge for me and really became something that I was passionate about. What also became clear to me is that I was not as passionate about law. And so when I met my wife and she lived in LA and at the time was my girlfriend, I knew I didn't love being a lawyer. And so I thought this is a great time to move. And so I moved to LA. And when I moved to LA, it was, right as Obama had announced My Brother's Keeper as one of his initiatives. And so I was hired to run a coalition of boys and men of color who were working within LAUSD to get police out of LAUSD. So even though now we're talking a lot about defunding the police, I was doing this work years ago, and I think young Black and brown boys were doing this work years ago, really trying to get police in the school to prison pipeline out. Eventually, I realized that I missed doing the work, not just funding the work, and deciding who got the work at a foundation. And so I decided I wanted to be back at a nonprofit. And I had a friend who said, you should apply to be the executive director of the Bicycle Coalition. And this was the friend who had introduced me to my wife. It's the same friend that I was training for AIDS Life Cycle for. And so she had never really steered me wrong in the past. And she's like, you should apply for this job. And I was like, okay, I'll think about it. I went to the Bike Coalition website. I remember looking at everybody and being like, I don't know, this bike thing is really white. Like, I love riding my bike, but I don't know about all of these folks. And plus, my background was as a civil rights lawyer. And so people had always said, bike lanes are the first sign of gentrification. And so I just had this feeling like, could I do this? Is this good for my street cred? And then I had a really good friend who I worked with at a public health organization a few years before. Her name was Linda Liu. And, she was one of those, Linda and I were like work wives. And whenever white people would say crazy stuff at work, we actually had a Build-A-Bear that we had put, when you go to Build-A-Bear, you can make them say things. And she had put something in it that says, you're racist. And so whenever one of us we would have like a particularly annoying conversation, we would just go into my office and squeeze the bear, and it would be like, that's racist. And we would just like release it all. So Linda was the homie, and she lived in San Francisco. And she reached out to me and she said, LA County Bicycle Coalition is hiring an executive director. You should apply. I was like, oh yeah, I've already looked at that job. I'm not applying. And she really came at me hard. She's like, look, I'm a member of the San Francisco Bike Coalition. And I just feel like there aren't enough people who care about transportation, who also care about other social justice issues. And so the San Francisco Bike Coalition is getting a bunch of money from places like Google, right? Because all these young Google employees ride their bikes. But they're not talking about how Google is displacing people from the core of the city, how Google is making, housing unaffordable. We're not talking about how private buses are impacting public transportation. So we're really not covering the other ways that transportation shows up. And so she encouraged me strongly to think about the position again. And so I went ahead and I submitted an application, and I was surprised to learn that I got the job. Many people in the bike community were surprised to learn that I got the job because nobody had ever heard of me before. The bike community is relatively tight knit. And everybody kind of knows everybody. And by everybody, I mean the folks who have historically held power, right? Like the white folks who can afford to be professionals who do this work, whether or not that's advocacy, whether or not that's government work, whether or not that's at a private firm. Those folks all knew each other, and they didn't really know me. And they really didn't understand, I think, a lot of folks, what I hoped to bring to the work. Because I said from the very beginning, that the work was going to be really centered on an equity lens, right? I'm like, hey, I want to run your bicycle nonprofit and I want to do bicycle advocacy work, but I'm also Black and I'm also queer. And so if I do that work, those are the lenses through which I'm going to see all of this work. And the bike folks didn't really know what to make of it because nobody else had talked about that. But running a bicycle advocacy organization was the best job I ever had. It was when you love riding your bike as much as I love riding my bike, and you get to be on it every single day, and you get to wear shirts that are this wrinkled and no one notices because you're just on your bike all day. That's pretty cool. In addition to that, we helped get Vision Zero passed in Los Angeles, which was, this initiative that said people dying because they're biking and walking and they get hit by cars, that's unacceptable. And the thing that makes me so proud about this picture is that in a lot of other cities, when you talk about Vision Zero, it was a bunch of like white guys in spandex saying like, hey, I'm a second-class citizen. But we had such a diverse coalition of folks. Not even all of them were transportation organizations. We had civil rights organizations. We had community groups. We had a housing land trust. Just folks who knew that people in their communities rode bikes and they deserved to be safe. It was a very prominent position. I was constantly giving press conferences with all the big elected officials in LA, including Mayor Eric Garcetti, who many people think is going to be the next transportation secretary. We'll see. We launched Bike Share while I was at the LA County Bicycle Coalition, and so I was a big part of getting Bike Share in LA and getting Bike Share in the different communities in LA. And then, we also passed Measure M, which was the first ballot measure in LA County that funded specifically biking and walking. So we've had a lot of transportation related ballot measures in LA, but we never had one that specifically allocated money to infrastructure and resources and education classes for people who bike. And so that was a really proud moment for me. And then last but not least, I was the LA County Bicycle Coalition executive director. So I got to go to the Emmys. I got to go to the Emmys on a bike. I got to ride up on the red carpet on a bike with the head of the Department of Transportation, Salita Reynolds, but also the guy all the way on the end with sunglasses on his head is a producer for Mad Men. So we got to hang out with folks from Mad Men. We got to ride our bike across the city from his house in Santa Monica. And this was just like a normal day at the office. And so I really enjoyed the way in which I think people who love bikes know that bikes can literally take you to so many places and open so many doors. And that is something that I experienced, but something I also experienced was how hard the bike community would be. And so at the time I was living in Highland Park here, and we had a council member who refused to put a bike lane down a particular street. And all the crash data showed that people were dying on that street nonstop. And in fact, my wife and I were eating outside at a restaurant one day. We heard a loud crash and we ran to see who it was. And it was a woman who was crossing the street who was hit and killed. And that was kind of the last straw for a lot of people. And as a result, this person decided to run for city council. And he decided to run for city council to oppose this elected official. And he wanted to run as someone who owned a bike shop. He was a bike person. Everyone in the bike community was really excited that this could finally be their chance to get a bike lane. And everybody loved this person for that. I was never a big fan, like many women and many people of color, because he was always just an asshole to us. And then, not surprising to us, it came out later in the election that he had been on dark parts of the interweb using the N-word, making fun of fat people and saying they deserve to be raped because they were fat, saying trans people were indecisive, saying that, you know, disabled people should be aborted, all kinds of horrible things. And at the end of the day, most people in the bike community still wanted him to win. And in fact, some prominent people in the bike community wrote think pieces about the fact that he may have done these things, but he would get them a bike lane. And so they had to vote for him. And so I think at a time in our country where shit seems really crazy and everyone is wondering, how are there people who are standing by silently and not saying the wrong thing, or not saying the right thing, or not acknowledging that what's happening is wrong? Like, you have to realize that every day, particularly in the transportation space, particularly in the engineering space, where diversity is a huge problem, there are probably instances every day where you know something is wrong and you don't speak up. And so the big lesson I always try to teach people is that I don't think that bikes discriminate, but I do think people do. And people who ride bikes also discriminate. This is a great picture from Bicycling Magazine, where I was lucky enough to co-edit an entire issue where we just shared stories from Black people who love to ride bikes. And the reality is, when Black folks talk about racism, or any folks of color talk about racism, whether it's in the planning world, the engineering world, the biking world, people often ask, like, well, why can't you just shut up and bike? Why do you have to make this about race? And I think part of the pushback is everything we do should include conversations about race. If I have an option of whether or not I'm going to do something and not talk about race, or I'm going to do it and talk about race, I'm probably going to talk about race. But unfortunately, a lot of folks are just uninterested in that option. They don't want to talk about these things because it feels hard, and it feels like, well, I just want to ride my bike. I just want to think about this lane width. I just want to design this intersection. I don't want to have to talk about any of these things. But I think most of us who go into this work because we care about people and we want to help people, right? Like, I have gone into this work because I have a family. I have a wife and a son, and I want to know that when they're driving or walking or biking, that they're going to be safe, and that they're going to come home, and that they're going to, you know, be okay because of work I'm doing. And I don't want to make things worse. I want to make things better. But, you know, I also share this picture whenever I'm talking about race work, because this is my wife, Kelly. And Kelly is French Canadian, and so I always joke around with people, she's not just white, she's really white. And when Kelly's parents named her, they named her Kelly because they felt like it was a unisex name, that she couldn't be discriminated against if someone saw her resume. They did the same with her sister, Robin. And my parents did something different. They named me Tamika, and they named my sister Tanisha. So we're Black. And their whole philosophy was like, if people are going to discriminate against you, like, we'd rather them just do it. Like, you know, you're Black and we want folks to know you're Black. And so I think when we were naming our son, it was really hard because we were coming from two totally different places, two totally different backgrounds and upbringings and ideas around what names mean. And I think that that's true when we try to do equity work professionally, particularly if we are people of color. You may be approaching a situation with a totally different background as someone else, but you have to figure out a way to both understand and acknowledge their history and where they're from, but try to find a way to come together. The other thing that I like to share this picture for is because Kelly and I had a lot of conversations about raising our son genderless, and you know, letting him decide when he grew up whether or not he wanted to identify as you know, a man or a woman. based on his gender identity. And we ultimately decided that that was irresponsible, because at the end of the day, the world was going to see him as a Black man. And whether or not we wanted it, people would make judgments about what that meant. And that would also mean that he was going to be unsafe, because it is unsafe to be a Black man in this country. And so once we made that decision that we needed to raise him to know what that means to be a Black man in this country, Kelly, as my French Canadian white wife, didn't get to say, well, you got this. Like, that's not my job. You're the Black mom. You handle it. But often when we try to do this work professionally, we do just that. We say, well, I don't know how to design for people of color. I'm not a person of color. Well, I don't have a disability. Well, I'm not a woman. And just like in parenting, once we commit to doing something, and again, theoretically, if we all want to do this work in some way to help people, then we don't get to check out. We don't get to just put that work on certain people. We don't get to just say, if we want equity and we don't want, our design to be racist, then it's up to the people of color to figure that out. And so, I just hope that as you think about why you're going into this profession or why you are in this profession, you can think about how perhaps you want to help people. And we can all be on the same page that, like, we want to do good, we don't want to do harm, right? And I know sometimes that's hard, because sometimes it seems like we're all on the same page about that. But again, we're in a country right now where folks who we used to think were all on the same page perhaps are not on the same page. And beyond that, we're dealing with two major crises in our country. Both COVID-19 and racism are totally ravaging our country right now. And sometimes it feels like we live in two different countries, where some people's top priority is having a boozy brunch, and other people are literally taking to the streets trying to say, like, this won't stand. And sometimes people say, well, the message is muddled. I don't know what people are talking about. And I think that also comes up sometimes when we do, community meetings in our profession. We'll go to a meeting and somebody will ask a question that's not a transportation question. And we'll say, well, I'm just a transportation engineer. I don't know what I can't answer your question on housing. And the reality is that for the people who are out on the streets, for the people who are in our community meetings, they are full human beings. And so even though we might think we're just a transportation person, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because the people who we theoretically want to help don't lead single issue lives, right? And we know that that's particularly true for people of color, where we have seen folks say, well, what does policing, have to do with transit? Well, we've heard for years that transit is a way that police are using to hunt Black and brown people. We also know, no matter what you think about, does transportation have to do with equity and racism? Absolutely. It started off the civil rights movement. Ever since one woman said, nah, not today, I'm not going to the back. That was the very beginning of when race was a critical part of transportation. And it's not just transportation. When you talk about our prison system, when you talk about climate change and environmental justice, when you talk about education and segregation, and beyond anything else, we've all heard of redlining recently. And if you haven't heard of redlining, and if you haven't heard of this book, I strongly suggest that you do and that you read it. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. And it's a good book. I've been on panels with the author, but the other thing that's really important to know about this book is it says that it's about a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And again, I would just say, forgotten to who? Because I think there are many folks of color who continue to live with the vestiges of segregation and racism, again, through every system of society, that haven't forgotten about it. And that's even more true today, where again, we have a virus that is killing people. If you ask low-income people of color if they know somebody who's been lost to COVID, they'd probably say yes. I lost one of my best friends from college, Black woman. If you ask people who are people of color, do you know someone who's an essential worker and who's never stopped working during this pandemic? They will probably say yes, my mom, my sister, right? And also, we just have to acknowledge that it's not just the virus, it's also policing, right? In this picture, you can see a green bike lane behind a police officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck until he died. I've never seen the video. I've only seen this picture because I refuse to watch the video. But what I can tell you is that for those of us who have to live every day knowing the realities of our existence in this country, as much as we love this work, we know no matter how perfectly we engineer that green bike lane in the background, it's not going to save our lives. It's not going to allow us to walk around our neighborhood with Skittles and just be a carefree kid. It's not going to allow us to run in our own neighborhood just down the street. And here in LA, we are keenly aware that you could be biking and you could be stopped for something you've done wrong, and it could lead with you losing your life. And one of the things I love about the bike community, and I do like, I do love the bike community. I've had a ton of good experiences. And a lot of my really good white man bike friends in the bike community, what I love about them is they know the law better than most police officers when it comes to what they can and can't do on their bike. And the number of white men who again are my friends, who I have seen be stopped by police officers and kind of just like snap at them and tell them how wrong they are and that they don't know the law and they never have to fear losing their lives. But for so many of us Black folks, we have to worry about if the only reason that people ultimately know who we are is because we become a hashtag. And then we're supposed to go to school or go to work or join the Zoom call and pretend like everything's okay. And it's not okay. And this is a slide that I like to give a seizure warning to because it's a bit much, but that's literally how it feels right now, sometimes trying to do this work. Like it's all so fast, you don't know what to do, you're not okay, but it seems like no one cares. And for people who don't have to think about this stuff all the time, like for those of us who might be folks of color, but have privilege because maybe we're not Black, or have privilege maybe because we have a certain level of education or we have a certain income level. If you don't have to think about this stuff all the time, it could feel like too much. You could be, sitting behind your Zoom just wanting to pull your hair out. And something a lot of times when I have these conversations with folks that I hear is like, yeah, I hear you. The world is racist, but I'm not racist. Why can't you just make this stop? Because it's just a lot. And what I always say is like, it is a lot, but just remember, if you don't have to think about this stuff all the time, it's probably because you have privilege. If this stuff doesn't personally impact you and therefore you think it's not a problem or you don't think it has a place in our work, then it's probably because you have privilege. And you might want the conversations to stop and you might feel like it's overwhelming and you just need it to end. But really the thing that needs to end is that people need to stop killing Black folks. And so if we all agree that people need to stop killing Black folks, but sometimes it feels like, but how do I do that as a planner? How do I do that as an engineer? And so you're constantly asking yourself, well, what can I do? Well, I think for folks who are interested in engineering, one of the things I would suggest is that the ITE Journal did this awesome issue that was all about equity. At their annual conference this past summer, they also did a ton of panels on equity, which you can find online. But I would say that they are trying to do better. And I was lucky enough to co-author an article about how to place equity at the center of our work. And in order to do that, you first have to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion are words that are used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing, right? Diversity is like the easiest word to understand. It's like you just get people who are diverse and you get them around the table, right? Think about 90s clip art. Like get the guy who seems to be a religious minority, but make him look really, really happy. Is that a white guy? Put him in the back and make him look awkward. What? Is that somebody in a wheelchair? Put them in the front. And then women, lots of women, right? That's diversity, just simply having a ton of diverse faces at the table. But if you actually want to get to equity, you have to have that middle step of inclusion. And inclusion doesn't just mean that diverse people are at the table, it means that they actually have power. So sure, maybe you have diverse voices or diverse faces at the table, but you never hear their voice. If they aren't decision makers, if they are able to shape culture, then that's not true inclusion. People like to say inclusion is, I want everybody to feel welcome here. That's not inclusion. That's like inclusion 101 for people who don't actually really want to do the work. True inclusion means that folks who have historically had the power have to relinquish some of that power and have to make sure that there are those diverse faces, but you also hear those voices and you also listen to those opinions. And frankly, those opinions are leaders. They have the power to shape decisions, to shape culture. And when we think of equity, this is a picture that a lot of people like to think about, right? Looking over the fence. And if you give everybody the same thing, the tall person who could already see could still see. The short person who couldn't see still can't see. I don't like this picture. And if you're ever doing a presentation and you use this picture, you should stop, or you should question the person who's using it, unless they're only using it to tell you not to use it, right? Because it doesn't show the reality. It doesn't show that some people are starting off way ahead and some people are starting at a disadvantage. And beyond that, it doesn't actually show what we should be trying to achieve. When I think about why I do transportation work, it's all about liberation, right? Ever since my ancestors were brought here and told that we had to work for free as enslaved peoples, we've been trying to get free, right? I am doing this Zoom call from stolen Tongva land. We are inhabiting land where folks are still trying to get free, right? And so when I think about transportation, it's about, can people move freely? Can people get to the places and people and resources they need and love, and can they do it with dignity? It's all about liberation. But beyond being about liberation, I think we also have to talk about power and privilege, right? Because at the end of the day, what this picture lacks is that someone has still decided that our ultimate goal is watching a baseball game, right? So sure, we've taken down the proverbial fence that lets us see the game, but what fence is there where someone has still decided that I like baseball? What if I don't like baseball? What if I want to play in the game? What if I want to coach the team? What if I want to own the team? What if I, am a budding entrepreneur and I want to sell peanuts in the stand on the way to launching an empire, right? And the reality is that that's why terms like empowerment are so colonial, because it's still presupposing that there's somebody worthy of power who can bestow it upon other people, and not that folks have the own agency to determine what their freedom looks like. And when we're doing this work, we have to realize that folks have power. It's not just about having power over people, it's also having power with people. And when we think about how we engineer towards equity, we have to own that there is a history, and a lot of it is wrapped into built environment, and engineers have an active role into building equity into the planning and design process, are perpetuating past harms, right? And if you don't want to perpetuate past harms, you have to look at project decisions through a framework of equity. And notice I didn't say lens, because lenses are things you can take on and off. A framework is something that you put on top of it and it is permanent. You're not trying to retrofit it after the fact. And then you have to be deliberate and knowing what your project's purpose is, how it's going to direct, and address issues of equity, and more than anything, how community are going to be at the forefront of the design process. When you do that, you are engineering towards equity. And when you think about the individual change you want to make, I always tell people, take these 5 questions, write them on a Post-it note, put them near your mirror, and ask yourself every single day, like, do you understand that not being racist isn't the same as actively being anti-racist? What is it that makes you so afraid to be brave and confront these issues, right? Because if you're undocumented and you know that ICE is doing sweeps, but you still go to work every day, that's brave. If you're trans and you use the bathroom of your choice, like, that's brave. You don't know what's going to happen. And so for those of us who say, well, I just want to be safer, I just want to be comfortable, we have to ask ourselves, why are we so afraid to be brave? Why are we so afraid to decenter whiteness? Which means, what data do we view as acceptable and valid, and what data do we disregard? Just because something hasn't been experienced by you personally, does that mean it's not true? And the last 2, why aren't you thinking about racism and white supremacy every single day? Again, there are those of us who have to. We think about it when we raise our son, we think about it when we name our son. Why aren't you thinking about it every day? And then what in your work are you doing to stop the killing of Black people? And when you make that individual change, when you get to the point where you realize that this just isn't a moment in time, that it's an actual movement, how do you move along that journey. And as someone who's a transportation planner, I'll admit I'm a visual person. I like journeys and I like knowing what my path is. And so I always like to explain to people, when you start off on this path of wanting to incorporate equity into all you do, you might start off as an actor. And I use Mel Gibson here because I'm old, first of all, but two, because Mel Gibson was blowing up in the media yesterday. Because despite the fact that Mel Gibson has done some pretty atrocious things, he was cast in another movie and the trailer dropped yesterday, and he's going to be playing this role as a grumpy Santa Claus, right? Whatever. The reason I use Mel Gibson is because he is a great actor. Look at him. Look at those awards. He has been respected and honored by his peers, right? And you might also know that Mel Gibson is a horrible person. He was pulled over by a cop, said anti-Semitic things, said he hoped his pregnant partner got raped by N-words, right? He's just not a great person. And so when I say this journey starts off in the actor stage, what I mean is that at first, you're just acting. You're just faking it until you make it. You don't know why someone wants you to capitalize Black, but not capitalize white. You don't know why someone uses they, them pronouns instead of him or hers. You don't understand those things, but you know that that's something that you should do. And so you're just going along with it. And so sometimes you just have to fake it until you make it. But Mel Gibson is that cautionary tale. If you don't truly integrate and explore and understand why you're doing those things, that at some point you will slip up and it will be revealed that you don't actually care about doing the work. You just care about looking good. But if you care about doing the work and you actually take the time to integrate and to think about why you're doing what you're doing, well, then you can be an ally. And an ally isn't just turning your social media Black or rainbow, depending on the month. Being an ally is actually a noun, or is actually an action. It's taking an action. It's doing something. It's standing up. And so we want to understand that you have to get from just being an actor and you have to get from just being an ally. And then more and more, what we have to understand is that the world is changing, and beyond allies, we need accomplices. And the main difference between an ally and an accomplice is that an accomplice is willing to risk something. We all know that person in class or that person at a job who's always speaking up and talking about race. And we see other people roll their eyes or avoid them or never want to be in a group with them or not put them on the cool projects. And so sometimes we're willing to be an ally, but not an accomplice, because we don't want to be put in the same group as them. We don't want to lose anything. But that woman of color who's speaking up all the time is risking something every time she does it. That might be her mental health, it may be her job, it may be a lot of things. But we have to ask ourselves, what makes us say when a woman is in a meeting and she says something and everybody ignores it, and then 10 minutes later a man says something and everyone is like, John, that's a good idea. What makes us after the meeting pull her aside or shoot her an email and say, hey, Marisa, I realize you said that before John, and I just want you to know I heard you. Why not just say that in the meeting? That's the difference between an ally and an accomplice. You'll do it in public. You'll do it in the moment. Sometimes you'll do it before they even have to say anything because you're willing to lose something. And this journey isn't static. It's not like once you reach the accomplice mountaintop, you're there forever. There are going to be some days where you just don't have it, so you're just acting. There are going to be some issues where you're an accomplice, but other issues where you're an ally. I might be an accomplice on things around race and gender because I'm a Black woman, but I might not be as great about disability rights. I have friends who call me out all the time and say, yo, that whole, sidewalk dining thing, cool, love it. But I can't get down the sidewalk on my wheelchair now. Aren't you supposed to be the equity expert? And you're just posting all these things about how great this is. So it's not that you get to one place and then you're absolved and then you're great. This is constant work. It's a constant journey. And all you have to do is be kind with yourself. Know you're going to make mistakes, but that you are going to continue to push forward, that you are going to continue to do this work. And then once you're part of an institution, how can you take that personal work you're doing and also include in the things you're doing at work? How can they make change? How can they confront power and privilege in a way that takes down those invisible fences? How can you make sure that there is a brave space where people can be honest, where people can make mistakes and be forgiven, and fall off the bike, clip back in, and keep going? How do you understand power? Who's making the decisions? And are those the same people most impacted by the decisions? Why? And then how do you analyze privilege? Who is valued? Whose ideas are valued? What credentials? What are the requirements for the job, right? How do we do all these things and constantly ask our institutions to do them? Because again, if you want to make equity actionable, you have to be willing to do the work. You have to understand that while you may want people like me to just shut up and bike, that for us, we don't have an option. This is just the life we live and how we experience the world. And so if you are a person who for some reason doesn't have to do that all the time nonstop, how can you force yourself to do it even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one else is doing it? How can you be brave, and how can you make equity actionable in all that you do? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Tamika. That was the best thing that I've done so far with my club. I really appreciate your talk.
Of course, of course.
So you had one question here.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh,
I see
let's
one
see.
on Measure M. I can do that one first. So
Yeah.
can I talk more about how Vision Zero and Measure M offer protection for cyclists and pedestrians? How are funds used to benefit cyclists? So Vision Zero specifically, and Vision Zero definitely isn't just an LA thing, right? So cities across the world have enacted Vision Zero, and it actually started in Scandinavian countries. And the idea around Vision Zero are that you use the E's, right? So engineering, education, encouragement, to change the way you do things as a city or a transportation department, and to make sure that it is safer for all users. And it's become increasingly important because in a lot of places in this country, from the public health side, not even the transportation side, traffic violence has become a leading cause of death. And so what many folks in Vision Zero were saying, many folks of color were saying before, and I think more folks are saying now, one of the E's is enforcement. And so they're trying to figure out how to take that E out of it. But basically what any city does when they launch Vision Zero, they usually create a high injury network. And so they use all of their crash data and they figure out what corridors, what streets are the most dangerous. And then they can use that data to break it down by mode. And if there's a particular street or corridor where people who are biking or people who are walking are the ones getting hit and killed most often, then yes, they typically look to infrastructure improvements to change that. And how do they pay for that? Well, it depends on the city. But in LA County, one of the ways people have been paying for Vision Zero improvements is through Measure M. And so the way Measure M worked, it was a very political process that I could do a whole nother talk on just Measure M, but essentially to get buy-in, because it is a sales tax. And so to get buy-in from all of the jurisdictions, what they had to do, Metro had to promise that there would be some local control. And so Metro is going to get some of that money, but individual cities also get allocated some of that money. And so in individual cities, they're going to have Measure M dollars that they can use to spend on transportation things and the way they see fit. But of the big pot of money that Metro gets, we were able to earmark a specific amount of it for active transportation. And so what that means is some of that can be used for education classes. Metro gives out a lot of funding to nonprofits like the Bike Coalition to teach bicycle education classes. It could be used for infrastructure, things like more bike lanes. A lot of what Metro talks about is using it for first last mile so that people can get to and from transit. And so infrastructure and that first last mile. So hopefully that answers that question. Is there another one? So it has been really difficult for folks in quarantine to get to things. And that's why, I think sometimes in the transportation space, there are these folks who, especially in the bike space, who are like, cars are evil. I hate cars. We should ban all cars. And I think it's really privileged to have this framework that all cars are bad. I do think they're bad for the environment. I do enjoy being on my bike more, but we also have to acknowledge that, first of all, for a really long time in society, getting a car was part of making it, right? I used to work with a colleague whose dad was an immigrant, and he was saying that his dad got a job interview at some place that was walkable from their house, and his dad still drove. And when he asked his dad why, he said, because if they see me walking up, they're going to think I'm poor and that I can't do the job, right? And so I think to a certain extent, like the car versus bikes, or car versus walking, or car versus transit conversations we have are toxic and privileged and full of coded racism. I also think it's been really tough because in order to provide transportation, we need more reliable transit. And what we're actually seeing happening as a result of COVID and as a result of the federal government not really supporting transit in the way they should during this pandemic is that lines are actually being cut, not increased. We're seeing some private companies step up, and companies like Uber and Lyft are saying, if you're low income, we'll give you a ride to go here. Now, are there issues with Uber and Lyft? Like, probably, but I think that's, one of the things that makes transit so tough is that it's something that is so tied to so many parts of our lives, but people still see it as something very behind the scenes that they just kind of take for granted as a given. And so we don't necessarily invest in it in the way we should. Let's see. Engineers and projects. I've heard about the mayor's office starting beautification projects by cleaning up streets, repainting curbs. Is this a big step in the right direction? Or is there more that could be done in terms of the transportation field? Definitely more that can be done, right? But I do think this is something that is true about all aspects of the work we do. I think it's important to clean things up, but I also think we have to be really thoughtful about when things get cleaned up, what are we trying to do? And so like in Orange County, right? Just like in LA, there are a lot of conversations about cleaning up folks who are experiencing homelessness, right? Cleaning up a park and updating it might mean putting in a bench that has a bar in the middle so someone can't lay there. And so whether or not something is a big step or a step in the right direction, I think we can't just think about what the articulated intents of the projects are, but also what is the impact and who are the disproportionate impacts on. And so that's kind of how I would think about that. Anything else?
I had a quick question about the slide that you showed, the equity, equality, and how it should be liberation. And like I have like an idea of like what equality or / equity would look like in society. But I have a hard time of like grasping what would it look like for society to be like liberated.
Yeah.
So like I was hoping you could explain that.
Yeah, and I think the answer is we don't know, right? Like, and I think what's so hard is take defunding the police, which is just something very concrete, whether or not you agree with it or don't agree with it. Defunding the police, I think part of why people say it's hard for people who disagree with it. Some people just fundamentally disagree, but I think there are these people in the middle who are like, I'm with you, but then what do we do? Right? And so I think so often when we're fighting for equity or liberation, part of what slows us down is people saying, but what would we do instead? And what I challenge people to realize is that's something that really only shuts us down when frankly it's people of color leading the way, or we're fighting to change the status quo. Because when a young white tech person is thinking, I want to create something, no one's saying, but then what, right? No one is saying like, Mark, but why would people use Facebook? right? Like there is some ability to fail and to try new things and to aim for something, even when folks don't understand yet what you would do in its place. If somebody said, I want to get rid of the concept that in order to talk to someone on the telephone, you have to have it connected to the wall in a wire. If someone was like, no, it should be easier than that. You should be able to talk to somebody on a phone anywhere. And beyond that, you should be able to take pictures and record pictures, right? Like there was a time in history where someone probably said, that doesn't make sense. Like why would you do that? But we know that we only progress as a society because there are some people who are allowed to fail. There are some people who are allowed to dream. There are some people who are allowed to fight for something, even though they don't know what's on the other side of it. And I think too often folks of color aren't allowed to fail in that way, which is insane because many of us are immigrants. Many of us are folks who were enslaved. Many of us have, our ancestors come from countries where there have been regimes that we've had to escape. Like as folks of color, we are people who know better than anyone how to imagine a reality, even when we don't know what's on the other side. I don't know what's for me in the United States, but I'm going to give it a try. I don't know what it would be like to not be a slave because I've only ever been a slave, but I know we should be free, right? And so what is it that stops us from shooting for something just because we don't know what it looks like, when in fact I think that's what a lot of this country has been built on, believing in something could be better and striving for it, even if you don't know what's on the other side of it. And I think the other thing that's really hard is that people ask me all the time professionally, like, can you come do an equity workshop and do you have an equity toolkit? And maybe they would call it a liberation toolkit. And the reality is for every community that looks different. And so it's really hard to say what would be in the toolkit when the main thing about what would be in the toolkit is, are the people most impacted part of the decision making, right? And so I know sometimes people have that question about like gentrification and displacement. How do you create a community that improves on what is there but doesn't displace the people who are already living there, right? And I have friends, I have Latinx friends who grew up in Northeast LA who are like, look, I don't want to be a gentrifier, but I'm not mad that when I moved home, there was finally a Whole Foods. There was finally a bowling alley with the little hipster bowling balls, right? And so I think it's not that we don't like nice things as folks of color or low income folks. I think the difference in how you do it. And I think too often, and I think it's a principle focused on whiteness, we focused on solutions. We focus on the end goals. What is the neighborhood going to look like? What is liberation going to look like? But if we focused on the process and we just trusted that we could get to an outcome, that would be transformative. But that is not how we're trained. We are not trained to go to community meetings and say, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but let's try it. We're trained to go to community meetings and say, you have option A, option B, option 3. Here are some stickers. Which one do you like the best, right? And I think truly fighting against things, whether it's gentrification and displacement or fighting for liberation, you have to be willing to trust in community knowledge. You have to be able to trust in that ability for folks to self-determine where they want to go. And you have to include community input. And so you can't just, people think outreach and engagement are the same thing. Outreach is saying, here's what we're going to do. Tell us your thoughts. Engagement is saying, here's what we're thinking. Are we wrong? Do you like it? What would you do differently? And that, I think, is harder for people. Sounds like a lot of folks have to go. Should we?
Yeah, it's only if you have to go.
I'm okay.
Okay, great. Then I think there's some questions from Grace and Sean, if you want to read them.
What would you say would you say it's more important to keep in mind as we go forward with future projects? Grace, I'm not sure if your question makes sense to me. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. This is just based on the question that Abbas made. I guess just would you say that you said we shouldn't it shouldn't so much be a question of what's going to happen next, or like, you know, how, I don't know how to explain this. Sorry, would you just say that the idea of just, you know, focusing on making things better is just sort of idea we should have as we're making future solutions and projects, more than just like we are specifically working out a plan for.
Yeah, I think a good example, right, is I used to be the executive director after the Bike Coalition. I was an executive director at the LA Neighborhood Land Trust, and we built parks and gardens. Our whole mission was to build parks and gardens in low-income communities, to make it so that everybody in Los Angeles had a 10-minute walk to a park, right? And if that was our mission, then we knew going into any particular meeting with community that our goal was to build a park, right? Like, now we might be open to what the park included or what it looked like, but our goal was to build a park. So that might be outreach, right? Going and saying, hey, X community, we're going to build a park on this lot. What do you want it to include? But we actually believed in true engagement. And so before we ever got to we're going to build a park, what do you want it to include? We would go and we would have house meetings, we would knock on people's door, and we would pass out flyers, and we would go to the churches, and we would have these community meetings where we said, we are an organization that builds parks. Here's why we think parks are important. Here's what we think the benefit of parks are. Do you want a park in your community? And if people said no, and if they were like, no, that's where the gangbangers are going to hang out, then you can have a conversation. Well, why do you think the gangbangers are going to hang out? Don't you think your grandmother would hang out? Don't you think kids would hang out? Don't you think this? Like, no, like, because I never feel safe at a park, or, you know, whatever. You can have those conversations. But if they were like, we do not need a park, we need a grocery store. We do not need a park. We need more affordable housing. Then we would say, as a park developer, okay, well, the council member who's offering us this lot of land for free, we're going to go back to them and we're going to say, your community doesn't want a park, they want affordable housing. And that is hard to do, right? Our whole mission is to build parks. That is our job. But we had to change our framework, that we weren't failing at our job if we were listening to people. And I think too often we're set up in these structures that we think our job is to accomplish the task that someone who is our supervisor told us to accomplish. But in reality, our job is to help people, right? And I think that sometimes is hard. I'm not gonna say it's not hard, especially when you're a consultant or when you work in government. Like, your job is also to make your client happy or to make your boss happy. And sometimes they feel like their job is to spin down money before the grant cycle. So yes, I think it is something to keep in mind. And any chance you get, how can you infuse that way of thinking into your decision making? So I don't know if that helps, Grace, but that's kind of, I think, what I got on a Friday afternoon.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Tamika. I'll keep it to the last question because I think people are starting to go. But Emily had a question: create change within civil companies, and I really think this is interesting because you have cases where, you know, certain large mayors of certain large cities they were kind of known as you know, leaders of equity and, you know, complete streets, talking about how you know, we're gonna do better as a city, and on the other hand, they are the face of like police brutality nowadays, right? So as somebody who's gone through that struggle a lot and pushing the envelope continuously, do you have any advice to people, to young professionals?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, especially young professionals of color, we can very quickly get into a space where we're like, oh man, I gotta speak up, because we look around and we're like, if we don't speak up, who else is gonna speak up? And so the first thing I would say is like, yes, I think speak up, do the right thing. However, and this is a quote I always say, you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. So at the end of the day, like, someone like me, right? Like, my parents didn't go to college. They've since gone to college since I graduated from law school. But when I was in law school, my parents hadn't gone to college. They didn't have the same opportunities I was going to have graduating from Stanford Law School. And so I would never judge somebody who I went to law school with, like many folks of color I went to law school with, who were going to be the most successful person in their family, I never judged them for saying, well, I'm going to take a job at a law firm and make shitloads of money. I'm not going to go be like a legal aid lawyer, right? Because at the end of the day, we have to do what feels safe for us. I'm extremely queer. I feel like people know I'm gay when they see me walking down the street, right? But if it doesn't feel safe to put up a picture of your partner, or to hold hands, or to, when everyone's saying we're having a company party, bring your guests, if it doesn't feel safe, I think we have to get to a place where we're not calling one another sellouts. If we don't show up in the way we think other people should show up, because at the end of the day, we, like, our representation matters and being there matters, and we don't always have to sacrifice ourselves to help other people. Because I think part of it is realizing that at some of these organizations, they don't actually want help. And so I think sometimes it's about, this is a job, here's what I'm going to get out of this job, here's the training I'm going to get out of this job. And part of that is learning what I would do differently, but I don't have to make myself unsafe to help people. And I think part of it is realizing when you're giving too much of yourself and it's doing more harm to you. I think the other thing that's really important is find your allies and your accomplices in your organization, because they usually are there. And the last thing I will say is find mentors and friends. You should always be thinking about, in any situation, who am I learning with and who am I learning from, right? And I have a group of friends who are all around the same age as me, all came into the work at the same time, and we support each other. And so even though I might be really brave in a meeting and I might speak up, I might go home and cry. And I have those people in my life who I've surrounded myself with who can hold that space for me. But I've also really cultivated mentors and leaders who are above me, who I can go to, who I can seek advice from. And so people really have to make sure, when people are like, you have my contact information, email me, do it, right? And so make sure you nurture those relationships and nurture yourself.
Wow, great answer. Thanks so much, Tamika. It seems like that's the end of the question. So yeah, we'll wrap up the talk. I just wanted to share with everyone real quick that Tamika is going to be speaking at UCLA's Institute of Transportation Studies Symposium called Lake Arrowhead. And you have all these amazing transportation experts here with her, along with Veronica Davis, who's a civil engineer, and kind of expanding on the concept of arrested mobility. So yeah, I think that's it.
I will just say, if you love engineering, know who Veronica Davis is. She's one of my dear friends, and she thinks about this stuff in amazing ways. So definitely don't be afraid to look her up, follow her on Twitter, send her an email and tell her Tamika said to. She's great. So definitely learn about who she is.
Definitely. And you've been really driving, or your work has been driving what we're trying to try and elevate ourselves from allies to accomplices. So I really appreciate you.
Of course. Thanks, folks. Have a great weekend. Don't be afraid to reach out if you need anything. Keenan has my contact information. Feel free to share it, and I'm happy to help.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tamika. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Have a good weekend. Bye, folks.
Thank you, Tamika.
Bye. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for coming.